Silence, please. No talking. Well, blessings, beloved. I am back. I am Mama Pam, aka Pamela Dobson, of the SMRF Family International Interactive Ministry, where we do read the Word of God, beloved, 7 minutes every day, so you don't have to. This segment of today's read today is Monday, November the 13th, 2023, and we are resuming our reading from EnduringWord.com. I'm just simply reading from EnduringWord.com. Ezekiel, the 7th chapter, resuming on verses 19 through 22. In that day, material things will be of no help. Think about what's going over in Israel today, right? Right now, think about what's going on in Israel. Their silver and their gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. So the completeness of the coming judgment meant that it would also affect both rich and poor. The wrath of the rich would give them no advantage. They will throw their silver into the streets as burdensome and not beneficial to them. Thus, Judas threw away his wages of wickedness, and many of their deathbeds detest their cursed hoards of ill-gotten goods, saying unto them as once, away from me, away, away. Generally, silver and gold stand for much among the children of men. They are the keys to the unlocking of the treasures of life. But when the supreme crisis comes, when all hands are feeble and all knees as weak as water, when the day of the wrath of the Lord breaks, there's no help in silver and gold. They cannot satisfy or save, because it becomes their stumbling block of iniquity. Their riches got them into trouble. They cannot rescue them from the trouble. Therefore, I've made it like refuse to them. The word here, and in Ezekiel 7:19, translated refuse, refers to sexual impurity, such as the ritual uncleanness associated with menstruation. Refuse. This word nida belongs to the language of female impurity, expresses the revulsion that will be felt not only towards their wealth, but also towards their beautiful ornament. Ezekiel 7:20, their expensively decked idols. Money would be thrown away like something sexually unclean. Leviticus 20 through 21. He said it in majesty, but they made from it the images of their abominations. Now God blessed Israel with wealth and resources, but they used those things to further and promote idolatry. Fittingly, all that wealth would be given as plunder into the hands of strangers. They will defile my secret place. God even announced that robbers would sack his temple, including the secret place, the Holy of Holies. So this coming judgment will be complete, not sparing even the temple. 23:27, in that day all human help will fail. Make a chain, for the land is filled with crimes of blood. This was like a chain to restrain violent criminals, those guilty of crimes of blood. God would allow great judgment to be a punishment and restraint to his violent, wicked people. Ezekiel was commanded to perform a symbolic act by making a chain which was emblematic of the captivity waiting them. Jeremiah 27:2, Jeremiah 27:2, Nahum 3:10. In Nahum 3:10, this word describes the treatment of prisoners of war, in this instant consisting of persons from the upper class. The chain would have been used to tie the captives together to form a long train headed for exile. Crimes of blood. Judicial murderers occurs only here. The phrase is best understood as murderous judicial decisions rather than crimes of violence. Therefore, I will bring the worst of the Gentiles. God made no claim that the invaders would be good or righteous. They were instruments of his severe correction against his people. But they were not good. They were the worst of the Gentiles. Now the Jews were bad enough, but the Chaldees were worse. The worst might be malignants above measure. Panar, Panaropala, Panaropolitans, breathing devils. A hard nut must have a harder wedge, as the proverb is. How he may use a more wicked population to punish a less wicked one may create theological problems for mortal minds, but it is consistent with his sovereignty overall. They will see peace, but there shall be none. There would be no quickly made peace, treaty, or tribute paid to prevent the disasters. It would surely come. Then they will seek a vision from a prophet. Frightened by the disaster and confused by the rumor, some would finally seek a word from God. In that day of judgment, there would be none. The law will perish from the priest, and the counsel from the elders. Ezekiel 7:26 seems to be an answer to what was said in Jerusalem at the time, as recorded in Jeremiah 18:18. Then they said, "Come and let us devise plans against Jeremiah. For the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Come and let us attack him with the tongue, and let us not give heed to any of his words." The king will mourn. In the eyes of Ezekiel, the king was Jehoiakim, Ezekiel 1 and 2, and the prince was Zedekiah. Though Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, the prophet didn't recognize his reign, but considered him only a prince. Ezekiel 12:10 and 12. According to what they deserve, I will judge them. This was a terrible promise. Israel had sinned greatly, so a great judgment was coming upon them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. The triple repetition in this chapter makes the point strongly. God's purpose was not Israel's pain, but their restoration to a true relationship with God. God don't want none of us to have no pain, but no pain, no gain. So in order to get us to pay attention, just like we have to spank, tap them booties on our babies, tap, 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 tap that little booty every once in a while. God got to tap, 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 tap us every once in a while too. All right, Ezekiel 8, abominations at the temple. So in the 6th year, in the 6th month, Ezekiel 1 and 2 began a series of visions beginning with in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. This is a new time marker describing visions that happened about a year and a half later. This series of visions is in Ezekiel 8 and 11. Ezekiel 8 and 11 is a record of one long vision. In the beginning of the vision, Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord at the temple in Jerusalem. By the end of the vision, Ezekiel 10 and 11, this glory will depart. They also supply us with a date corresponding to 17th of September 592. Therefore, something more than a year after, Ezekiel had received his prophetic call. I sat in my house with the elders of Judah, sitting before me. So this reminds us that Ezekiel had his own house, and that he was respected enough as God's prophet to receive the elders of Judah for an audience in his house. Now, the reason for their presence in Ezekiel's house is not given, though Ezekiel 14, 1 through 3, and Ezekiel 21 suggest that they came to him customarily to seek a word from God. It makes sense. Wise men would go to the man or woman of God to seek for advice. The hand of God fell upon me there. As before in Ezekiel 1, 3, 3, 14, 22, Ezekiel felt the presence and strength of God upon him. 2 through 4, in a vision, Ezekiel is transported to Jerusalem. Now there was a likeness like the appearance of fire. Ezekiel saw something similar to the likeness he saw in the vision of God and his glory in the first chapter. Ezekiel 1:27. That was a representation of God in some human likeness, and we see the same here. He stretched out the form of a hand. Now, in this vision, something like a hand grabbed Ezekiel by the hair, and the Spirit carried him between heaven and earth, bringing him to Jerusalem in a vision. Ezekiel had this spiritual vision of Jerusalem in the days when Jeremiah served as a prophet. In that period between the second envisioning of the Babylonians and their final conquest of Jerusalem. That he did not actually leave Babylon is clearer from Ezekiel 11 and 24. He was carried back in spirit to Babylon after the visions were completed. Ezekiel 11, 22 and 25. In this vision, Ezekiel saw 4 abominations at the temple. They were probably not literal in the sense that they were happening all at the same time at the temple, and Ezekiel saw this in real time. God showed Ezekiel what was literally happening in both an outward and in a spiritual sense. The outrageous idol associated with the king in Ezekiel 8, 5, and 6. The images and censers associated with the city leaders, Ezekiel 8, 7, and 13. The weeping over Tammuz associated with the women, Ezekiel 8, 14, and 15. The worship of the sun associated with the priests, Ezekiel 8, 16, and 18. Ezekiel 8, 16, and 18. To the north gate of the inner court. Specifically, Ezekiel came to the temple as a priest. He had a special interest not only in the temple but also in all that happened there, where the seat of the image of jealousy was. In this vision, Ezekiel apparently saw an idolatrous image, the image of jealousy, standing in the inner court. This was likely right outside the temple building itself. It was called the image of jealousy because it provoked to jealousy. It was an insult both to God and to his temple and to his people. Hezekiah removed idolatry from Judah, 2 Kings 18, 1 through 5. But his son Manasseh restored it and made it worse than ever, even putting an idol into the temple. 2 Kings 21, 1 and 7. Manasseh's son Ammon continued the state-sponsored idolatry of his father. King Josiah cleansed Judah of the idolatry and burned the idol Manasseh had put in the temple in 2 Kings 23, 4 and 20. Now we see that the idol in the temple was back. The word image is semel, which occurs elsewhere only in Deuteronomy 4:16, where it is translated figure, and in 2 Chronicles 33, 7-15, of a special idol set up by King Manasseh in the temple. Although this idol was later removed, Ezekiel's use of the word may seem that a replica, if not the original, was put back. The word also occurs in Phoenician writings. Behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there. In his vision, Ezekiel saw the same glory of God that he saw in the plain. The glory of God was present at the temple of God in Jerusalem. There's a strong contrast between this glory and the debased idols and idolatry Ezekiel will see in the rest of this vision. God's glory filled the tabernacle, Exodus 40, 34, Exodus 40, 34 through 35, and later the temple, 1 Kings 8, 11. By the end of this vision, Ezekiel 10 and 11, the glory of the Lord will no longer dwell in the temple. Verse 5, Ezekiel looks to the north. Lift your eyes now toward the north. If one stood facing the entrance to the temple, the north would be on the right side. We don't know which way Ezekiel had to turn, but he was directed to face toward the north. North of the altar gate was the image of jealousy in the entrance. There again, Ezekiel saw this idol in the temple court. It was called the image of jealousy because it provoked God to holy jealousy. The connection of this image with the north gate, Ezekiel 8:3, was significant. Connecting this image of jealousy was royalty and the king. This was the most honorable of the three gateways because the royal palace being on the north side of the temple, the king would have used it whenever he went in to worship. Verses 6-8, the great and greater abominations. Now, the great abominations that the house of Israel commits were the greater abominations that the house of Israel commits here. Ezekiel saw the image of jealousy, and God told him that it was represented the great abominations of Israel. To make me go far away from my sanctuary. The idolatry was so persistent and offensive to God that it made him determined to go far away. It was his sanctuary, belonging to God himself, but he would leave it because of their abomination, because they're great abomination. Now turn again, you will see greater abominations. And what Ezekiel saw was bad enough, but God now promised to show him worse things, greater abominations. He said, son of man, dig into the wall to see those greater abominations. So Ezekiel had to dig through a wall to see in his vision what was inside the temple itself. While we may puzzle over how he's able to dig a hole in the wall, or why he does not use the existing entrance to this door, the visionary nature of this entire unit removes the necessity for realism or logical consistency. In spiritual application, this shows that it may take some effort and energy to truly see the interior. If only an easy or surface observation is allowed, the true state of things may not be seen. So basically, something that's hidden, something that's covered. You got to dig deep to see it. Wicked things and blind men. Verses 9-12. Wicked things and blind men. Every sort of creeping thing, the abominable beast, and all the idols. In his vision, Ezekiel saw the inside of the temple with all sorts of unclean and idolatrous things, portrayed all around on the walls. The interior of the temple was supposed to have cherubim surrounding God's throne, portrayed on the walls, and instead it had filthy idols. God called these wicked abominations, the most abominable wickedness. These are loathsome in their nature and multiplied in number before me. The consensus of the interpreters is that these were the animal cults of Egypt. See Romans 1:23. In Egypt, such worship had perhaps its highest and most extensive development in ancient times. This piece of idolatry the Jews had learned of the Egyptians, who madly worshipped oxen, asses, goats, dogs, cats, serpents, crocodiles, the birds, the beasts, and on and on and on. I told you guys there's over 30,000 idols, I think it said in India. 30,000? No, million. 30 million, 30 million. I'm like, how? Because they worship everything, anything. There stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. In front of these foul and idolatrous images were the leaders of Israel, each with the censer giving out a thick cloud of incense. They offered priestly service and incense associated with prayers in the midst of the idolatry and impurity. How are you going to do that today? Today here in America, these hip-hop artists say they serve God, we serve God, and we serve the devil at the same time, and they do it all in God's house. And the preachers be letting them. And the preachers be right there with them, letting them. Elders refer to lay leaders who had risen to prominence in Jerusalem after the deportation of Jehoiakim and his officials. 2 Kings 24:12-16. These were obviously important men in the city. Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. Shaphan is probably to be identified with Josiah's Secretary of State in 2 Kings 22:3. And Ahikam, Another of Sapphan's sons was an influential supporter of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 26:24. Clearly, Jaazaniah was the black sheep of a worthy family. Have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols. So God showed Ezekiel that the vision was about what the leaders of Israel did in the dark and in the room of his idols. It wasn't about what the leaders did in the temple, but the hidden place of their heart was filled with dark deeds and idolatry. Yet they carried on the service as if all was right. Ezekiel was probably shocked to see that all these city leaders were secret idolaters. They had carried the idolatry of the temple into their private homes. Public and private worship was permitted with the God dishonoring idolatry, and they were smugly complacent in it all. While the external rites of the temple while the external rites of the temple of God were being observed, these very observances were made a cloak for the thoughts, the desires, and the activities of the heart. This was the most hopeless stage and state of pollution. Is it quite certain that evil thoughts and imaginations have not imprinted themselves on the walls of the heart? Ah, it may be so. What seems fair and beautiful in the eye of man may be concealing terrible secrets open only to that of God. The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. They excused their sin because they did not think God saw them, either in their minds or in their actions. They also excused their sin because they believed God had forsaken Israel, when in fact they had forsaken God. With this kind of rationalization, they permitted themselves to do anything they desired. If God did not exist, then no one need care about it. It is tragic that the same attitude exists today among so many people. What the men in this dark room are saying about God is in fact false about him, but it is true of the images before which they stand. Women weeping for Tammuz. You will see greater abominations, Ezekiel. Ezekiel saw idolatry outside the temple and corruption among the leaders within. Yet there were greater abominations to see. We need not then perplex our reader with a long discourse to show wherein these latter signs are greater than the former mentioned. They're all very great. Thank you, Sovereign. Thank you, Michelle. To my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. This is the only mention of Tammuz in Ezekiel and the Old Testament. This was another example of pagan worship, and Tammuz was a deity, worshipped by many in neighboring nations, often with immoral or impure rites. Ezekiel was dismayed because women were there in the holy place, reserved only for priests, and because of their immoral idolatry. It is likely that the prophet would have viewed the presence of women in the inner court as a profanation. The worship of Tammuz came from Babylon through Phoenicians, Canaanites, then the Greeks. Tammuz, mentions nowhere else in the scriptures, was the Babylonian Tamazi, beloved of Ishtar, and is to be identified with the Greek Adonis. In the seasonal mythological cycle, he died early in the fall when vegetation withered. His revival by the wailing of Ishtar was marked by the buzz of spring and the fertility of the land. Such renewal was encouraged and celebrated by licentious fertility festivals. With the worship of this god in ancient times were connected the basest immoralist, immoral, immoralities. Immoralities. With the greatest of abandon, women gave themselves up to most shameful practices. Today in America, women are giving it up to these idolatrous worshipers, taking their clothes out, twerking their booties, flapping their breasts, wearing no clothes, naked dressing, they call it naked dressing, seeing real sheer clothing and calling that having clothes on. Lord, help America. Verses 15 through 16, priests worshiping the sun. You will see greater abominations than these. So God continually promised Ezekiel that he would see greater and greater abominations. This time, his vision would display them in the inner court of the Lord's house. Idolatry of the 70 elders was hidden in the temple, but these men practiced idolatry openly. About 25 men with their backs toward the temple, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. These men stood where the priest would normally stand to bless the people. Yet, with the temple behind them, the altar before them, their faces towards the east, they were worshiping the sun toward the east. They didn't worship God, even at his own temple. They worshiped the sun, as the other pagan nations did. The number and the location of these men make it likely, though not certain, that they were priests. If they were priests, perhaps in Numbers 25, because there was a representative of each of the 24 courses of the priests, plus the high priest. These were worshipers, showed their contempt for God by standing in such a way that they had their backs to the temple while they reverenced the sun. 2 Kings 23:5 and 11, worshiping the creature rather than the creator. Romans 1 and 25. Block on the sun cult in Israel. So according to 2 Kings 21 and 5, it appears to have gained royal sponsorship during the reign of Manasseh, who built altars for the entire host of heaven in the courts of the temple, from 2 Kings 23:11 through 12. One may also infer that the horses and the chariots of the sun at the entrance of the temple that Josiah demolished had also been erected by Manasseh. Verses 17 through 18. Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations? In his vision of the temple, Ezekiel saw a terrible variety of idolatries and abominations. The leaders and people of Jerusalem regarded it all as a trivial thing. God did not. For they have filled the land with violence. These were not only religious or spiritual sins, their rejection of Yahweh and his truth and his true worship led to a breakdown in the social order. The inhabitants of Judah were not intent to provoke the Lord with their abominations. They had also filled the land with violence, social chaos, and injustice. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. This is an unusual statement used only here in the Old Testament. It was some observed expression of contempt for God. The phrase, put the branch to their nose, is obscure. Jewish commentators understand it to refer to some revolting and wicked rite. If it was a ritual act in an idolatrous cult, then it is grave indeed. But no such ritual act is known among Semitic peoples. Some take it to be a gesture of contempt toward God. Sticking the branch to the nose may simply describe an insulting physical gesture, here employed with euphemistically to express how God feels about the way his subjects have treated him. Wright had another idea. The branch held to the nose may have been in imitation of the Egyptian ankh, a symbol of life, which is shown in carvings as held to the nose. Or it may have been connected with plants sacred to Tammuz or some other god. Walter, and Hoop argue that the text has been corrupted and should read, a branch in my nose. All that the Lord is saying is that in place of the pleasant odor of honest sacrificial worship, Leviticus 1:19, what God is receiving from the Israelites comes as a stench in God's nostrils. I will not spare, nor will I have pity. Because of the great idolatries and sins of Jerusalem, and that the people regarded all as a trivial thing, God's judgment was assured and could not be turned back. So, because of this utter corruption of the people, Jehovah would proceed in judgment. In spite of all the loud crying of the people, God hereby affirms that from now on his ears are closed to all pleas for mercy. He will not allow his heart to overrule his head. All right, and last but not least, the ninth chapter. Bear with me. I'm hanging in here. Y'all hanging in here with me. Ezekiel 9, mark for preservation, mark for preservation, mark for judgment. Let those have charge over the city draw near. Now, in this vision of Jerusalem and the corruptions at the temple, in Ezekiel 8, Ezekiel heard God speaking with a loud voice, calling forth 6 men who, in some sense, had charge over the city. Those who had charge over the city were those whom God set to watch over the welfare of the city. They were not earthly agents, but heavenly. Angels are frequently called men because of their outward appearance, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. The 6 men of Ezekiel's vision were armed, each with a battle axe in his hand. It's best to understand these 6 men as angelic beings with responsibilities over Jerusalem. In ways we don't completely understand, sometimes beings have or desire assignments related to places to geography. This is true of both faithful and fallen angels. This is true. Faithful, God's angels, fallen angels, Satan's angels. In Daniel's day, a demonic spirit was assigned to Persia. In Daniel 10:13, Daniel 10:20, and to Greece in Daniel 11 and 20. In Daniel 12:1 says that Michael had some responsibility regarding Israel. Satan himself was connected with the king of Babylon, Isaiah 14. Mark 5:10 indicates that demons wanted to stay in one place and not be sent elsewhere by Jesus, which faces the north. The angelic executioners came from the way of the upper gate, which was built by Jotham, 2 Kings 15:35, called the upper Benjamin gate in Jeremiah 20 and 2, or the new gate, Jeremiah 26:10, 26:10. The gate was toward the north of the city, the direction from which the Babylonian invaders came, as well as the area where the idolatries had taken place. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn by his side. In addition to these 6 men, there was another dressed differently and who also carried an inkhorn ready to write. There's some debate among commentators as to if this one man among them is an additional person or included in the number of the 6 men. Kill and Dillich are among those who think there were a total of 7. In the midst of the 6 men furnished with smashing tools, there was one clothed in white byssus, with writing materials at his side. The dress and equipment, as well as the instructions which he afterwards received and executed, show him to be the prince of leader of the others. Linen was the fabric used for the dress of priest. In Ezekiel 28:29, 42, and angelic beings, Daniel 10:5, 12, 6 through 7. 2 classes of beings directly involved in divine service. At his side was a writing case. The word is peculiar to this chapter and may be a loan word from Egyptian, where it refers to the scribe's writing equipment, incorporating pen, inkhorn, and wax writing tablet. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar. So the 7 men, who actually seemed to be angels, were ready for service. They march in past the image of jealousy and the mourners for Tammuz and take their stand near the sun worshippers, invisible to all except Ezekiel. They stood beside the bronze altar to signify that the people against whom they had their commission were, for their crimes, to be sacrificed to the demands of divine justice. Verse 3 through 4, the command to mark the foreheads of godly men in Jerusalem. The glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub. So the visible representation of God's glory rose up higher than where the cherub stood. The Lord vividly demonstrated his readiness to judge by withdrawing his glory from his people. God's glory moved from the most holy place to the entry of the temple to assign the task of judgment, had gone up. The departure of the glory of the Lord from Israel is one of the basic disclosures of this prophetic book. So Ezekiel traces it very carefully in its different stages. Ezekiel 9 and 3, 10, 18 through 19, 43, 2 through 5. From the cherub. For the first time in this and the following chapters, the living creatures that were the support of the Lord's throne in Ezekiel's inaugural vision of Ezekiel 1 received the name that properly applies to them, cherub in the singular and collective, and in the plural, cherubim. Being of priestly descent, Ezekiel was undoubtedly familiar with the images of the cherubim in the temple. Apparently, this vision offered him an opportunity that was impossible in real life, a look into the inner sanctum of the divine palace, the Holy of Holies. Go through the midst of the city. Put a mark on the foreheads. So God commanded the one with the inkwell to mark the righteous men of the city. Ezekiel 9 and 6 shows this was a protective identification to protect them in the coming invasion, and also to protect them spiritually for the age to come. It shows that even when judgment comes upon an entire nation, God still knows how to mark and identify the righteous. Like the blood on the doorposts of the Israelites' houses on the night of the Passover in Exodus 12, and the scarlet cord in Rahab's window, Joshua 2:18 through 21, Joshua 6:22 through 25. It was a sign of hope. There is a prophetic significance in the Hebrew word for the mark. It is the Hebrew letter T, Ta, which at that time was written as a cross. Without being superstitious, we can rejoice in this anticipation of salvation through the death of Christ on the cross. Revelation 7:3 later describes God's servants again being sealed on their foreheads. Revelations 13:16 and several other passages also describe a latter satanic counterfeit of this mark, identifying allegiance to Satan and his false messiah. You see, Satan got a counterfeit for everything God do. See, we in Ezekiel, and God's talking about put a mark on the forehead. So Satan, when his kingdom doing this thing in the end in Revelation, put a mark on the forehead, the 666, the 636. So this is an allusion to the ancient, everywhere used custom of setting marks on servants and slaves to distinguish them from others. It was also common for the worshippers of particular idols to have their idols marked upon their foreheads, on their arms, etc. Of the men who sigh and cry over the abominations. Now, the remnant God would spare had nothing to do with age or perceived innocence. The remnant was those who had broken hearts over the idolatry and wickedness of the city, men like Jeremiah. The men who sighed will resurface in Ezekiel 21:6 and 7, where the moaning will be a symptom of a broken heart and intense grief over impending doom. In Ezekiel 24:17, sigh describes the grief that Ezekiel expresses over the death of his wife. Here the scribe is to search for individuals who will display a similar emotion over all the abominations being perpetrated in Jerusalem. Let us mourn in time of sinning, so shall we be marked in times of punishment. Amid sense of judgment, whether in the church or the world, there is always a remnant upon which is the mark. On Luke in Sodom, on Israel amid the plague of Egypt, on Rahab in the fall of Jericho, on the 144,000 at the Great Tribulation. They are safe amid the fiery indignation which devours the adversaries. Verse 5-7, the command to kill in judgment. Go after him through the city and kill. So God commanded the other of the 6 men to use their weapons of judgment against the city as a whole, sparing none except anyone on whom is the mark. Regard no state or sex, neither the loveliness of the virgin, nor the prettiness of the infant, nor the comeliness and gravity of the matron. Spare none. 2 Chronicles 36:17 describes the fulfillment of this. Therefore, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. And begin at my sanctuary. This is the church, y'all. He's saying start in the church. Start with the Pope and the priests and the prophets and the preachers, the pastors and the men. Start at the top and begin at my sanctuary. So God decrees that judgment should begin at his house. Peter later applied this principle to the people of God under the new covenant. 1 Peter 4:17. Therefore, these judging angels began with the elders who were before the temple. So in the sanctuary, God should have been most honored, but there he was most dishonored and provoked. And there his holiness would most fully and certainly be vindicated. Defile the temple and fill the courts with slain. So in Ezekiel 6:4-5 and 6:13, God promised that he would defile and desecrate the pagan altars on the high places because of Israel's idolatry. Here, he promised the same desecration at his own house. These people had defiled God's house by their wicked lives, and now they would defile it further in their terrible deaths. Ezekiel's reaction, Ezekiel's grief. I fell on my face and I cried out. Though Ezekiel had many times announced such a severe judgment, when he actually saw it carried out in his vision, it made him completely undone. For all Ezekiel's outward appearance of severity, beneath the hard shell, there was a heart that felt deeply for and with his people. He did not relish the message of judgment that he had to give, still less the reality that followed when the message was rejected. Will you destroy all the remnant of Israel in desperation? Ah, Lord God. Ezekiel begged God not to destroy the remnant as he poured out his fury on Jerusalem. 9:10, God's explanation. The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. God reminded Ezekiel what he had been preaching, that as terrible as the judgment was, it was fully deserved and a long time in coming. The Lord has forsaken the land and the Lord does not see. This is what the leaders of the city said earlier in Ezekiel's vision. Ezekiel 8:12. Because of their persistence, offensive rejection of God, God vowed, my eye will neither spare nor will I have pity. So since the righteous are marked, the fate of the wicked is sealed. For them there is no hope of escape. Verse 11, the report of the man with the inkhorn reported back. Angels are diligent and accountable in their service. Angels and men must all give account of their conduct to God. For although he is everywhere and his eye sees all things, yet they must personally account for all that they have done. I've done as you commanded me. So the angel could report that he had marked the faithful remnant in Jerusalem. This was an encouragement to Ezekiel that all of Judah had not strayed from God. Because the man with the writing kit reported, I've done as you commanded. In other words, the righteous ones had been marked. These grand words are reminiscent of the declaration of our Lord Jesus Christ in John 17:4. How worthwhile and fruitful was their life. May the Lord add a blessing to you, the hearer of this commentary read of the Word of God. We read commentary reading from enduringword.com. We read Ezekiel 7:22 through 27. We read chapter 8 and we read chapter 9 of Ezekiel. So now that's clarity. You have a better understanding of what we were reading about the vision. If you want to be a blessing to this woman of God, you can go to www.7minuteread.com. www.7minuteread.com. Pay close attention to how we spell the 7. SEV number 7 in, SEV number 7 in, 7minuteread.com. Also, now you can support Mama Pam by going to 7minutebling.com. 7minutebling.com. As you look on the wall to my right and to my left, you will see beautiful pieces of jewelry. Go there and check it out. Praise God. You can also be a blessing by going to YouTube, subscribing, thumbs up, and sharing. Share, like you really do care. Let Mama Pam know that you do care. Ah, I love you. See you back at 9 p.m. tonight. Central Standard Time. We'll be reading the Word of God. The same thing again. 30-minute segment. Get you in, get you out on the 30. I broadcast across 13 social media platforms at the same time. Y'all just look out there on these dating sites. You'll find me trying to bring everybody back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by way of Jesus Christ. God bless.